So first, a little bit about me, since I usually appreciate hearing this from other speakers. I currently live in Boulder, Colorado. Prior to that, I lived in the Bay Area for about 10 years. So I'm still in the honeymoon stages of being in Boulder. As you can see, I take selfies with the mountains like on the daily. This is from the balcony of the Twitter office there. Another interesting thing, or a interesting thing about me maybe, is that I am a big nerd about the Supreme Court. Some things that even some of my friends and coworkers don't know about me is that I peaked when I was in college because I got to be an intern at the Supreme Court. So if you want to hear any random facts about the history of the Supreme Court or the justices, you can hit me up later. And then this is what I've been actually working on recently. So not what I'm going to be talking about today, but I've been at Twitter for about 5 years, and recently I've been working on a project to redesign tweet details so that it makes it easier to read and to participate in conversations. The big change that we're doing with this project is, rather than develop it in secret over a period of long time, we're trying to put it out there frequently as a prototype so that, if you use Twitter and you're like, I don't really like this, you could always go back to the main app. And I think that this project was actually really served by some of the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about today, just being able to think a little bit longer term. So yeah, I'll get to that. So the stuff I'm going to talk to you today about is designing for the near future. Why is it important to think about the future now? How can you define your scope and recognize the trends that matter? How do you go about generating ideas through writing stories? And then lastly, how do you distill that into your organization's superpowers? I'm going to start with talking about the people on the team that worked on this project. I really don't think this is the type of project that could have been done alone. And I think it's because it's so ambiguous, right? You're trying to essentially think of what are different methods and processes we can use to ideate. And it really helped that there are 3 of us. So on my team were also Dan Saffer and Sean Thompson. And the fact that there were 3 of us meant that we could be talking about an idea, and we often needed to move forward, and being able to break a tie was really helpful. I think what also helped with this project is that we all came from non-traditionally designed backgrounds. So I was a history major, Sean was a government major, and Dan was an English major. And so that actually, I think, came in handy for this particular project. We all had strong opinions loosely held, which meant that over time we built a lot of trust. And so we are all confident in our ideas, but at the same time, we were always willing to be open-minded and listen to a different opinion and change our ideas. And I think that's really healthy. And then lastly, we had another person on our team who was kind of, generally helping us, guide us, and that was our director, Mike Krasinski. I would recommend, if you ever get a chance to work on a project where you're thinking a little further down, it's super important to have somebody in leadership who's providing you insights about what's going on in your organization, what they're thinking about, and then also just championing your project along the way. All right, so just a few years ago, self-driving cars seemed like science fiction. And part of it is because they're rendered in this way, right? In these futuristic settings. Watch Minority Report. Everything is very future. In contrast, look at this image. So a few years from now, there could be millions of self-driving cars on the road, and there'll just be another delivery car right next to a red pickup truck. A few years ago, Voice UI felt like a technology that maybe seemed to have stalled. And even today, Amazon Echoes, Google Homes are ubiquitous, but there's not a general consensus on whether or not they're essential to our everyday lives. And in a few years from now, we could actually be looking at UI or voice UI in everything. It could be in cars, appliances, and anything really with a microphone. And what's even more interesting is that there could be the possibility of deep fakes. This is a research project from last year where you can have one person's face being projected into another person's face. I think the interesting thing here is like, how do you anticipate these changes? This is probably a few years down, and how do you evolve your product to adapt to it? And here are a few more familiar examples. When you don't consider the future, you get left behind. So just a show of hands, I'm curious, how many of you in the audience have never been to a physical video rental store? Okay, a few, not that many actually. Yeah, so the difference between Blockbuster and Netflix. This was a tweet from July of last year. In 2000, Blockbuster had a chance to buy Netflix for $50 million. Today, Blockbuster is down to one store. Netflix is worth $172 billion. I think this speaks to the fact that the tables can easily turn. Another example is the need to order diapers. How many of you in the audience are parents? Oh, wow, a lot, okay. And of you parents, from your diaper buying days or currently, how many of you go to a physical store to buy diapers, primarily? Okay, a few. And how many of you buy your diapers on Amazon? Okay, it's kind of split. That's interesting. Yeah, what's also interesting about Amazon is that through things that are kind of continual, you need to buy diapers regularly, right? So either you do a subscription or you just go buy when you need it. And they've built kind of this entire store, this an ecosystem around all baby needs. So you can, while you're buying some diapers or some wipes, you can buy a hat too. It's very useful for us and for them. Another example is, think about like the change from going from a CD to the iPod to Spotify. These are big leaps, right? And evolving the iPod, you saw different generations of it, but it couldn't really become what you have with Spotify without the machine learning and the capabilities, that particular trend that's really powering a new way of listening to music. A quote from Mike is that you won't discover the future on a spreadsheet, and it really speaks to the fact that if you're just continually iterating a product, you're not going to get to these kind of breakthroughs or a new product that's really going to help your organization move in the future. So what else can you do? All right, so I think there's actually probably like, I don't know, a million ways to do this. And I'm here to tell you about a few that we tried at Twitter and that we thought were relatively successful. I hope to tell you some of the kind of, tips and also things that I learned along the way. And hopefully you can take some of this learning and apply it to your organization. So let's talk about time horizons. Ideally, everybody would be in number one. Many years out, try all the things. I don't think very many companies have the resources to do this, including Twitter. And then there's also number two, the other extreme, where you're really just constantly fighting fires and it's planning only 6 months out at a time. And that's also very dangerous for an organization to not be able to think further down the line. So the ideal scenario that we're going for, and we called this project 2022 because that felt like a good kind of time horizon to cap this, was a few years out, but with a narrow scope. The way that we tried to narrow the scope of this project was the company itself had already started investing in the framework Jobs to be Done. How many of you are familiar with it? Okay, quite a few. It basically, rather than thinking about things from a perspective of like, ooh, let's go build this cool feature, we're thinking about what are the actual needs that our customers have and how do we solve for those needs. And it really helped the entire company kind of speak the same language about what we should be doing. Twitter's Jobs to be Done are, there's different like nuances to these, but essentially it's helping people stay informed, helping people inform others, and then also helping people discuss. And when we're trying to think about what this project was really about, we had to figure out what the actual time frame is. So there is the immediate future, which I would say is roughly around 6 months to 2 years. There's the near future, which was what we wanted to focus on, which was 4 to 5 years. And then there's the far future. And in terms of the trends that we thought might be applicable to the near future, we read a bunch of like Forrester and different kind of like trends reports to distill it down to this list that we thought were the most salient for 4 to 5 year time frame. And then the ones that are highlighted in blue were the ones that we thought were most relevant to Twitter. Oh, we also tried to just take our jobs, and then it was like job plus, it's like a formula, job plus trend equals. And the problem there is it becomes really narrow, and whatever trend you visualize becomes the feature. And so we knew that this was not the right way to go about it. It's like, how can we extrapolate this to a higher level to help us generate these ideas? So we started by creating what we called trend groups, and I'll share a few of these with you. One, we called it interfaces around you. Information will appear when you need it in the format that you can use it best. New devices will let you engage with the digital world whenever and wherever. And then in terms of what actual trends rolled up to this, we thought would be AR, VR, Internet of Things, voice UI, and wearables. Another one is algorithms have surpassed human intelligence. Super fast computers will understand what the world is thinking and think for themselves. And then these are the trends. Another one is individual ideas will resonate more. The world's collective knowledge and feelings will be more understood and accessible. Hyper-networked citizens will accelerate the pace of ideas, causing change. So next we're like, okay, we got these trend groups. We should share them. We made these posters and displayed them around the design studio and invited people across the company to come and think about how these might impact their work. But we also just needed to come up with these ideas, and so we set about doing that. So we began to write stories. The work of writing these stories was heavily influenced by the Near Future Laboratory. They're a design studio, design and research studio, and a couple of the people on it are Julian Bleeker and Nick Foster. And we had the opportunity to attend a conference called the Primer Conference that kind of was like, this was their focus. And Julia and Nick spoke at this conference. One quote that I think really helped us to think about our work was, design is about the future in a way similar to science fiction. It probes imaginatively and materializes ideas the way science fiction materializes ideas, oftentimes through stories. Some of the artifacts that the Near Future Laboratory produce are these. They create things that are familiar to you, such as this IKEA catalog, but there's a twist on it. So each of the descriptions in there relate to some sort of Internet of Things feature. So the curtains here are light-emitting curtain provides healthful ambient energy, while hybrid polyester copper conductive threading prevents incursion of billions of watts of RF energy circulating the globe. So that's definitely not something you would expect to see. They also created this really interesting short film where you're in a convenience store. So like the peanuts, the beer, everything is very familiar, but there are twists on it, such as panda jerky. So through this influence and this inspiration, we decided to create what we called stories. They were tweet length, because it's Twitter, micro design fictions that take a common scenario and add a piece of the future to it, suggested by those trend groups that I showed you earlier. So if we could go back to the example of the two cars, the images that I showed you earlier, we wanted to create stories that were more similar to the car on the right, where you have the setting, you have the familiarity of this cars on the road, like real cars that you recognize, and then this, the technology that you wanted to show, versus the thing on the left where you have all this like chrome and futuristic setting. So when people look at the one on the left, they're like, oh, that's far out. Like we don't need a plan for that yet. But if you see the one on the if you see the one on the right, the car that's amongst other cars, then you're like, oh wow, actually we do need to think about this. So through the process of taking our jobs and then also thinking about them through the lens of our job groups, we generated over 300 stories/ideas. And here's an example of one of those stories. So I do need to say that I can't show you the stories that we're actually going to turn into things at Twitter, but I can show you a few that we aren't going to prioritize as examples. So this is one, we called it World Record. I throw a Hail Mary pass, and as soon as the ball is caught, Twitter sends a tweet recording it as the longest throw in high school football history. And the takeaway there is Twitter knows notable markers and can detect and tweet when someone has surpassed them. And the idea here is that you want to create a story, an idea, have an image to kind of put people in the right frame of mind to think about it, to imagine it. You want a title because you want to be able to reference it really quickly. We would like, all of us had by the end sort of internalized these names so we can refer to these ideas really quickly. The story itself, and then a takeaway so that if somebody else in your organization comes by and reads it, they know what the point of this is. It's kind of like distilling it into the main idea. In terms of best practices from that exercise, I would recommend trying to do 4 times the number that you think you can. So we thought we could generate like 50, and Mike was like, do 200. And by the time we reached 200, we're like, we could do 300. So that's what we did. I think it's really important to not edit yourself because in a process that's ambiguous, you're constantly kind of second guessing. And so once you allow yourself to be like, I'm just in idea generating phase, it really allows you to be a lot more creative. Make the stories really mundane. So in the beginning, we were writing these stories and they were like not Black Mirror episodes. Black Mirror episodes are actually good, but I'll get to that later. Making it mundane is kind of like what I've been saying over and over again is like, make sure the surrounding to your idea is not that exciting because you don't want people to get distracted by that. You don't want them to be like, ooh, in a future far, far away. Like, you don't want that. You want them to be like, okay, I'm just like, I got up, I brushed my teeth. Something, that's the thing you want people to pay attention to. This is related to the first one. Generate first, worry about editing, deduping later. We had tons of ideas that are essentially the same thing over and over again, and that's gonna happen, and that's okay. Okay, this is the part about Black Mirror. Avoid the darkness. One thing that is really easy to do when you think about the future is go to a dark place. And we struggle with that. And I think at some point, somebody had to call us out on it. She was like, all of your ideas are really depressing. And I was like, oh, but that's how it is. But once we actually recognize that and really try to not necessarily pretend it's not going to be the case, but try to think about it from the perspective of, I think our imagination lends itself to darkness sometimes. And so being aware of it and kind of allowing yourself to think beyond it was really helpful. And then lastly, we invited people from all over the company to explore the ideas generated, and we led workshops to help write more. And it's important to make sure that other people, other functions are involved and a part of the process. So one, they know how you got there, and also they got a chance to be a part of it. So the last part of my presentation is more about how do you sort, polish, and present your best ideas to a broader audience and get buy-in. So after we wrote all the stories, the 3 of us were like, something doesn't feel right, because design is not design unless you cluster things on Post-its, right? You gotta have that picture. So next thing we did was we clustered our stories, we named each cluster, and we wrote a description of its theme. And with that, we were able to do the thing that I think really kind of helped us distill them, is that for each theme, we described how our company might help people accomplish those goals. So for Twitter specifically, the question we asked ourselves was, equipped with Twitter, what can I accomplish in 4 to 5 years that I couldn't do before? So to show you some examples of the difference between a theme and a superpower, so for a theme, you might say, Twitter knows my level of expertise in a topic. You tweet all the time about astronomy. Twitter's like, I know you're an astronomy buff or an astronomer. And the superpower here is that I can understand any topic, because as a viewer, I can be able to basically know whatever's out there. Another theme is devices take action based on Twitter sentiment. So something that could happen is my stuff does things for me automatically. You could be like walking around and you're like, oh, I feel blue, and maybe you want Twitter to tweet that for you. Totally opt-in. Twitter knows my schedule. So just because a device or an application knows your schedule, what does that actually mean? It means that you don't actually miss anything, right? So as you can see, the superpowers are almost sort of like up-leveling to describe something that is very basic, can be accomplished. Among these superpowers is where we really started to find interesting and compelling opportunities that we felt like we could talk about. So for example, these are a few that did not make the cut. These are the less compelling ones. There was automatic tweets, which I mentioned earlier, kind of how it went from theme to superpower to this opportunity. Under certain circumstances, Twitter tweets on your behalf. There's also creator tools. Twitter helps compose better tweets and video by enhancing them, queuing them up, and tailoring them to specific audiences. There is collaborative Twitter. People can work together to create a single story that is shared between their audiences. So after all of that, once we had our list of opportunities, the next step was to sell our ideas. And I think this is the thing that could be a whole separate talk. There's so many different ways that you can go about this, and it really depends on the appetite within your company, how mature your company is, how you go about your processes. So you can make high fidelity stories. So we created storyboards, illustrations, illustrated storyboards, comics to share our ideas. You can also build prototypes. So a couple things we tried where we built an exhibit of a house and we put prototypes in it as like little booths. You can make movies, and movies they're really interesting. So they're considered like scenario prototyping. So you could have like a really short kind of like rough, you take the camera, follow somebody around and see somebody using your idea in a situation, or you can go out and produce like a full-on movie to kind of like play out at all hands and inspire people. There's a wide range with what you can do with a movie prototype. I think it's really important to conduct some user research to actually understand like whether people are interested in it outside of your company. And then lastly, think about how you can build it into a roadmap. So when you present these ideas as a designer to a product manager, it's really important to help them understand how you can go from point A to point B. What are the kind of steps you can take within what they are dealing with, the constraints that they have, to eventually build towards that future that you're excited about. And then just as like a parting note, I think something that we realize is that all design is really designing for the future, whether it be the immediate future, the near future, or the far future. And it's really just imagining a desirable state and then giving it form. All right, thank you so much for your time and attention. Those are the most important commodities of the future, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.